On our wedding day, Ethan's childhood friend, Emily, who has a heart condition, deliberately stopped her medication and attempted suicide to prevent our marriage. She was rushed to the emergency room, and Ethan, being her attending physician, hesitated, clearly torn about leaving. I graciously told him to go ahead, assuring him it was fine. In our previous life, despite his hesitation, Ethan stayed and went through with the wedding. However, shortly after, Emily passed away. Filled with resentment, Ethan neglected me and our daughter, treating Emily's child as his own. When our daughter was caught in a fire, he prioritized Emily's child, even transferring all his assets to Emily's parents and child. This time, I wanted to give him a chance, but why did he regret it now? The atmosphere at the wedding was heavy. Ethan, dressed in a suit and wearing the groom's boutonniere, received a call. His expression darkened, as though the celebration wasn't about him. Emily's having a heart attack. I need to go, he said urgently, removing the boutonniere as he left. While walking out, he was already on the phone, saying, "I'm on my way now." He hung up, took off his wedding ring, discarded his jacket, and hurriedly drove away. I had lost count of how many times Emily used her heart condition to summon Ethan away. If it weren't for my pregnancy, Ethan would never have agreed to marry me. Every time I brought up marriage, he would refuse, saying, "Emily's sick. I have to take care of her." I never understood why our marriage had anything to do with Emily's health. After he left, I walked up to the wedding stage, took the microphone, and announced that the wedding was canceled. I told the guests to treat the occasion as a casual gathering and enjoy the food. Then, I removed my cumbersome wedding dress and veil, feeling a wave of relief. In the past, whenever Ethan and Emily were alone, I would bombard him with 10 texts within an hour. But not anymore. I didn't argue or make a scene when he left. After the wedding was called off, I went to the hospital to schedule an abortion. If Ethan didn't want this child, I wouldn't use it to tie him down. Besides, in our previous life, our child suffered too much. She was severely burned in a fire, with over 70% of her body scarred. I called Ethan to inform him about canceling the wedding and my decision to terminate the pregnancy. "Let's separate," I said. When he answered, his furious voice cut through. "Madeline, what the hell is your rush? Emily's in the operating room right now. If you had a shred of decency, you wouldn't have picked her worst moment to get married." He hung up before I could explain. Standing outside the operating room, a doctor handed me the consent form. "Are you sure you don't want the child? Have you discussed this with your husband?" I nodded, confirming my decision. In our past life, Ethan stayed to marry me, but after Emily's death, he acted as if nothing had changed. However, after her funeral, he brought Emily's 4-year-old daughter, Chloe, home and had her call him Dad. He bathed, dressed, and even braided Chloe's hair himself. Chloe harbored hostility toward me, calling me a bad woman who had killed her mother. Despite being pregnant, maternal instincts made me pity the little girl who had lost her mother. I didn't hold her resentment against her. On the day I was due, Chloe pretended to be kind and asked me to take her to Disney. Thinking she had finally accepted me, I took her. Despite being heavily pregnant, she insisted on having ice cream and went to ride the carousel alone. But moments later, she vanished. Terrified, I called Ethan repeatedly. He arrived in a hurry. He gripped my wrist tightly. "Where's Chloe?" I sobbed as I tried to explain. She said she wanted to ride the carousel and told me to get her ice cream. I told her I'd stay with her and we'd get it later. But she insisted, crying and screaming until I went to buy it. Ethan's fury erupted. "She's just a little kid. How could you leave her alone like that? Do you honestly think this was intentional on her part? Could you live with yourself if something happened to Chloe? Don't expect me to forgive you if she gets hurt." His gaze darkened as it fell to my swollen belly. His expression filled with anger and disgust. After searching for an entire day and night, Chloe was finally found near a dumpster in an abandoned factory. Her tear-streaked face looked pitifully identical to Emily's. Ethan rushed over, scooping her into his arms as she burst into sobs. "Daddy, I was so scared," she cried. "Don't worry. Daddy's here." Ethan comforted her gently, holding her close. Then he turned to me, his expression cold and accusing. Madeline, you're about to be a mother yourself. How can you be so heartless? Wasn't it enough for you to have caused Emily's death? Chloe, sniffling, glanced at Ethan and whimpered. Daddy, don't blame Auntie. It's my fault. I won't ask for ice cream again. Ethan's eyes softened slightly, but his voice was sharp as he spoke again. Chloe, she's just upset because you accidentally broke her bracelet this morning. But Madeline, he said, his tone growing colder as he faced me. It was just a bracelet. Did you really need to lash out and abandon her over something so trivial? I felt my entire body tremble with rage and grief. Ethan, that bracelet was one of the few things my parents left me. It was all I had of them. I cried. But Ethan just sneered. They're dead. What's the point of holding on to something like that? Those words chilled me to the core. Still, guilt over how I had treated Chloe earlier led me to agree to her request to go to the amusement park. I thought taking her there would make things right. But as I glanced at Chloe perched smugly on Ethan's shoulder, the smirk she directed at me was full of defiance and mockery. From that day forward, Ethan never left Chloe alone with me. He even hired bodyguards and a nanny to ensure her safety. If I got within a few feet of her, the bodyguards would step in, their watchful eyes silently warning me to stay away. Ethan acted as if I were some sort of threat, going to extreme lengths to shield Chloe. Every holiday, instead of spending it with me, he would take Chloe to visit Emily's parents. On the day I went into labor, it coincided with Chloe's birthday. That morning, Chloe stood at the top of the stairs and gave me a chilling smile, one that sent shivers down my spine. It didn't feel like a child's smile. It was unsettling, almost malevolent. Then, without warning, she lunged at me, shoving me forcefully. I lost my balance and fell hard to the ground, my belly slamming against the floor. Pain shot through me so sharply I couldn't even scream. The bodyguards, having witnessed the collision, immediately rushed to Chloe's side to protect her. Their cold, robotic stare sent a clear message. I was the problem. Help me, please. I managed to gasp, clutching my abdomen as blood pooled beneath me. Chloe clung to one of the bodyguards and said sweetly, Uncle, take me to Daddy. I'm scared. The bodyguards, following Ethan's strict orders, ignored my pleas. One glanced at me indifferently before escorting Chloe away. My vision blurred as I dragged myself, bleeding and in excruciating pain, back to my room to grab my phone. Alone in the empty house, I dialed for an ambulance. The villa was far from the city, and rain poured heavily outside. It was rush hour, and traffic made it impossible for the ambulance to arrive quickly. When I called again, desperate for help, a cold voice on the other end replied, Sorry, ma'am. Ethan said there's no need to waste resources. He mentioned your due date isn't until next month. I screamed in agony. I'm in premature labor. Desperate, I called Ethan, gasping. I'm about to give birth. He scoffed, his voice filled with disdain. Don't play these tricks. I know your due date isn't until next month. Do you really think I don't see through your games? He assumed I was lying to stop him from celebrating Chloe's birthday. Alone in the villa, I endured an entire day and night of labor, using only water, a cloth, and scissors. I delivered my own baby. The moment my child's cries filled the air, I couldn't stop my own tears from streaming down. It wasn't until the next morning, when the housekeeper discovered me in that state, that I was rushed to the hospital. When Ethan's colleague finally saw me in the delivery room, Ethan had no choice but to believe I had truly given birth. But when he arrived at the hospital, his first words were not of concern but an accusation. Did you plan this on purpose? Did you make sure our daughter and Chloe would share the same birthday so they'd have to compete for attention? I looked at him with a blank expression. Ethan, Chloe pushed me. That's why I went into premature labor. His cold, dismissive eyes told me he didn't believe a word I said. Do you really think I'd fall for that? Save your lies. I suggested he check the villa's security footage, but Ethan refused. He had already decided I was at fault, and wouldn't even bother verifying the truth. Shortly after our child's birth, Ethan formally transferred all his assets to Chloe and Emily's parents, claiming it was to ensure Chloe's future. His indifference broke what little hope I had left. I filed for divorce. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze burning with anger as he growled, "You can't even handle this little bit of suffering? Let me tell you something, Madeline. I'll make sure you and your daughter are tormented for the rest of your lives. If it weren't for you forcing me into this marriage, Emily would still be alive." Years passed. My daughter turned 4, and Chloe was 8. One day, Chloe convinced my daughter to go out and play with her, only to abandon her in a desolate forest. Chloe came home crying, "Daddy, what if something happens to my sister? She's lost." Ethan's immediate response wasn't worry but comfort. "It's not your fault. She's just being mischievous." When my daughter was finally found, she was hiding inside a hollow tree. Her face was scratched. Her hands were bleeding from splinters, and her clothes were filthy with mud. I held her tightly as she cried, her small body trembling. "Mommy, I was so scared," she sobbed. Chloe ran up to us and began to cry loudly, as if trying to overshadow my daughter's pain. From that day forward, I refused to let Chloe and my daughter be alone together. Ethan mocked me for being overprotective. "You should be glad your daughter doesn't harm others," he sneered. I ignored his words. If Ethan had been willing to agree to a divorce, I wouldn't have stayed a second longer. But fate always seemed to have more cruel twists in store. One day, a fire broke out in the house. Both Chloe and my daughter were trapped inside. I panicked and tried to run in, but Ethan grabbed my arm. "I'll go. You stay here," he said firmly before rushing into the burning villa. When he emerged, he was carrying Chloe. He laid her down safely, then turned to go back inside for our daughter. But by then, the flames had grown too intense. Without professional firefighters, it was impossible to re-enter. When my daughter was finally rescued, her body was covered in severe burns. She cried out in pain every day, her small voice filled with anguish. I stayed with her in the sterile hospital room until the day she passed away. I couldn't bear the heartbreak and fell gravely ill myself, dying not long after. But then, I woke up. It was the day of the wedding again. This time, I knew better. I wouldn't marry Ethan, and I wouldn't let my child endure such a miserable fate. Because I loved her, I couldn't allow her to be born into this torment again. After my surgery, the doctor reminded me to avoid cold foods and take care not to catch a chill. I nodded silently and left. Back at the apartment Ethan and I shared, I packed my belongings swiftly, including all my important documents. Before leaving, I sent Ethan a message. "I've moved out." As I dragged my suitcase downstairs, I ran into Ethan. He looked surprised to see me, his face still tense from whatever had occupied him. "Where are you going?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. I told him I was moving out. He nodded absent-mindedly, saying, "Emily is still in the hospital. I'm just grabbing some clothes to take back there. I'll be staying at the hospital for the next few days. Do whatever you want." With that, he left in a hurry. He thought I meant I was moving to the new house, but I didn't bother to correct him. He wouldn't have cared enough to listen anyway. Watching Ethan's hurried, anxious figure disappear, I took a deep breath. When had he ever shown that kind of urgency for me? After the miscarriage, my lower abdomen still ached faintly. While picking up some medication at the hospital, I unexpectedly ran into Ethan. He had just finished a surgery, and his exhaustion was evident. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was pale. The moment he saw me, he frowned and approached quickly. "Madeline, why are you here?" His tone was tense, as if worried I had come to cause trouble for Emily. "Go home," he said urgently. Just then, Ethan's colleague, Dr. Jacob Joe, rushed over and called out, "Madeline, remember to keep your wound dry." In my previous life, after Jacob sent the ambulance for me, he had apologized profusely and even voluntarily stepped down from his position to help take care of me during my recovery. He had shown more care than Ethan ever did as a husband. I would never forget how Jacob had supported me during my most difficult moments. I smiled at Jacob and nodded. "Thank you. I will." Ethan looked like he wanted to ask me something, but before he could speak, a patient hurried over and pointed toward Emily's room. "Dr. Spencer, your wife is having heart trouble again. You need to check on her." Those words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Both Jacob and Ethan turned to look at me simultaneously. Ethan opened his mouth. "She's not my..." But I cut him off. "I'm leaving now." I turned and walked away. ignoring the commotion behind me. On my way out, an elderly woman suddenly grabbed my hand and asked, "Young lady, are you married? Do you have a partner?" I shook my head and said, "No." Ethan, who had been frozen in place, snapped his gaze toward me, startled. Before he could say anything, I left quickly. I felt relieved, once again thankful that I had never registered my marriage with Ethan. Back home, Jacob called me, "Madeline, remember, no spicy food after a miscarriage. And be careful not to let your wound get wet." He hesitated for a moment before asking cautiously, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead," I replied. His tone was careful, almost hesitant. "Did you and Ethan register your marriage? Was the wedding finalized?" I didn't know why Jacob was suddenly curious about this, but I answered truthfully, "No, the wedding was canceled, and we didn't register." Jacob seemed to let out a small sigh of relief and muttered softly, "That's good." For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard. Not long after Emily was discharged from the hospital, Ethan called me, "Madeline, Emily's out now. I'd like her to move into the house. Are you okay with that?" I froze for a moment before replying, "Sure. Do whatever you want. It's your house anyway. What does it have to do with me?" I hung up before he could respond. In the past, even the slightest hint of affection between Ethan and Emily would have made me jealous, let alone having her move into our home. When Ethan and I first started living together, Emily constantly showed up at our place. She wore my slippers, changed into my pajamas whenever I was away on business trips, and lounged in our bedroom during the day while Ethan was at work. When I returned and saw her there, I demanded she leave. She pouted and hid behind Ethan, who sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Madeline, I think of Emily as a sister. What's the big deal about a sister staying at her brother's house? Stop being jealous over nothing." I was hurt, but Ethan dismissed me impatiently. "If you can't handle it, then you can move out." I thought the call had ended then, but it hadn't. Ethan's voice came through the line again, filled with uncertainty. "Do you really mean it doesn't matter?" I laughed lightly, thinking, exactly, what does it have to do with me? It's your house. After all, when Ethan ran off without hesitation on our wedding day, I had already announced the cancellation of the wedding and decided not to register our marriage. As far as I was concerned, we were both single now. Ethan emphasized his words, his tone deliberate and sharp. "Madeline, don't speak in anger. Emily is sick, and I can't just leave her alone. She's like a sister to me." Calmly, I replied, "Sure. In my previous life, after getting pregnant and marrying him, I had quit my job. This time, without a marriage or a child tying me down, I continued working smoothly. So, when my manager asked if I was willing to transfer to South City for a promotion, I accepted without hesitation. I had no reason to stay. My parents passed away when I was 18, leaving me without family or attachments here. After work, I went to a company dinner with my colleagues. By chance, I spotted Ethan at a nearby table, also having dinner with his coworkers. When I went to the restroom, I ran into him in the smoking area. Our eyes met briefly, and I continued walking. On my way out, I was surprised to see him waiting for me at the door. I smiled politely and nodded, but he grabbed my arm. "Why didn't you say hello to me?" he asked. I looked at him, confused. Before I could respond, some people called out to him from the private room, "Ethan, Emily is looking for you." Emily poked her head out of the room, her voice sweet and clingy. "Ethan, why are you taking so long?" Our eyes met, and Emily's face lit up with a seemingly innocent smile. "Madeline, you're here too," she chirped, walking toward me. Seeing her made me feel nauseous. Her face reminded me of her daughter, and I couldn't suppress the disgust and chill that ran through me. Despite this, Emily smiled warmly. "Madeline, why don't you come in and join us? These are all Ethan's coworkers." I declined with a slight shake of my head. The sight of her alone was unbearable. During our relationship, when Ethan and I first lived together, Emily often showed up unannounced. She wore my slippers, borrowed my clothes when I was away, and even made herself at home in our bedroom. When I told her to leave, she would hide behind Ethan, pouting. Ethan would sigh in exasperation. "She's like my little sister. What's wrong with her staying here? Stop being so jealous. I was hurt but never knew how to respond. Ethan's patience with me wore thin. If you can't handle it, then move out, he said. Once, I accidentally overheard him on the phone. He asked someone, "Do you really think this doesn't bother her?" That moment still lingered painfully in my memory. During those days, I tried to be a supportive partner. I would bring Ethan lunch at the hospital, but he always turned me away. Why are you here? This is a hospital, not a place for random visits. He'd say coldly, I'm bringing you food. I replied, trying to ignore his tone. He sneered, I don't need it. Stop hanging around here. It's disruptive and reflects poorly on me. I'm busy and don't have time for this. His words stung deeply. I couldn't understand why it was inappropriate for me, his girlfriend, to visit him. After that, I never went to the hospital again. Yet, Emily often posted about her visits on social media. One post showed her sitting in Ethan's car, small cakes in hand. The caption read, I said I wanted these, and he bought them for me. If it weren't for her posts, I would have never known Ethan could be so considerate. Another post a few days later showed her at the hospital with Starbucks coffee and cake. He works so hard. I'm here to brighten his day. Ethan had scolded me for bringing him lunch but seemed perfectly fine with Emily showing up with treats. Feeling hurt, I asked him once, why is it okay for Emily to visit you at work, but not me? He frowned, clearly irritated. It's not the same. Emily doesn't cause me trouble. It was no surprise that many of Ethan's colleagues thought Emily was his girlfriend. Their closeness made it easy for people to misunderstand. At the dinner, a few of Ethan's coworkers came out of the private room and called him, Ethan, your wife is still waiting. My colleagues, noticing the exchange, turned to me and asked jokingly, is that your husband? I glanced at Ethan and replied flatly, no, none of my coworkers recognized him because, on our wedding day, he had left in such a rush that they never got the chance to see him. As the evening wound down, Ethan sent me a message. Let's head back together tonight. His tone was assertive, leaving no room for refusal. In the underground parking lot, I suddenly remembered the apartment Ethan bought before the wedding. It was listed under both our names as a joint purchase. Now that the wedding was off, we'd need to discuss what to do with it. To avoid any public confrontation in front of his colleagues, I reluctantly got into his car. As I approached the car, Emily stood in front of the passenger seat door. Ethan quickly explained, Emily gets carsick easily. You should sit in the back. I hadn't intended to sit in the front, but their eagerness to secure their arrangement felt almost too much. The car's heater was on high, making the interior uncomfortably warm. Emily kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror, her lips curling into a subtle smile. Her hand rested casually in her pocket, where the wedding ring Ethan and I had planned to exchange likely was. I reached into my bag and pulled out the red velvet box containing the ring. Emily turned around, her face lighting up with curiosity. Madeline, your wedding rings are so beautiful. Can I try it on? Her voice was sweet but carried an underlying smugness. Ethan glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his expression tense, as though he feared I might refuse. I smiled and nodded. Sure. If you like it, you can have it. Ethan slammed on the brakes, jerking the car to a sudden stop. He turned around, his eyes filled with confusion and disbelief. Madeline, this is our wedding ring. I shrugged indifferently. I know. Ethan frowned, his face clouded with a mix of emotions. Then why would you give it to Emily? He seemed about to say more, but we had already arrived at the apartment. Ethan brought Emily upstairs while I waited by the entrance. When he came back down and saw me standing there, he asked, Aren't you coming inside? I shook my head. I'll wait here. There's something we need to discuss. Ethan stopped in his tracks, confused. What is it? Our wedding is canceled, and we didn't register our marriage. What should we do with the apartment? Since we bought it together, we need to figure out the ownership. Do you want to refund me my half? Or should I refund you? Either way, I'd like to keep the property. He stared at me, completely stunned. Madeline, what's gotten into you? You've been acting so strange tonight. Even your colleagues didn't know how to answer when they asked about us. Why did you deny our relationship? Is it because I didn't attend the wedding? His bewildered tone made me laugh. Ethan, didn't your colleagues also mistake Emily for your wife? Besides, you didn't show up for our wedding, and we didn't register our marriage. What relationship do we even have? Ethan rubbed his temples, sighing deeply. Fine. I'll admit I was wrong about the wedding. Okay. But Madeline, I'm Emily's attending physician. I understand her condition better than anyone else. If I hadn't rushed to her side, she could have died. Saving lives is my responsibility. I couldn't prioritize my personal desires over someone's life. I stayed silent, listening. Ethan and I had met in college. He was the star of the medical school, tall, handsome, and widely admired. During our military training survival exercise, we were allowed to form teams for 3 days and nights. I got separated from my group and lost my way. As night fell, I slipped and tumbled down a hillside. Ethan carried me back up to the main trail, even though it took hours. When the temperature dropped overnight, he took off his jacket and draped it over me. I developed a fever, and he used the only clean towel he had to dampen with water and bring my temperature down. He stayed up all night tending to me until the rescue team arrived. From that moment on, I couldn't help but develop feelings for him. Back at school, we had no further interaction. I silently admired him from afar, gathering bits and pieces of information about his life. When I heard about his breakup, I felt both heartbroken and hopeful. I thought he might have noticed my feelings because, during our senior year, we had an unexpected encounter. One night at a bar, Ethan was sitting alone in the corner, drowning his sorrows. I was with a group of classmates, but my attention kept drifting toward him. Pretending not to notice, I stole a glance in his direction, thinking I was subtle. Little did I know, he had noticed me all along. He walked toward me with a glass of wine, leaned in close, and whispered, "Can I?" His lips brushed against mine before I even realized what was happening, and somehow, I found myself nodding. That night, we naturally ended up together, but the passion he showed that evening quickly cooled, replaced by an indifference I tried hard not to notice. I was already too deep in the dream of my one-sided love becoming real to admit the truth. Later, Emily reached out to me. That was when I discovered the reason Ethan had chosen to be with me. It was to get back at her. She had been seeing someone else, and he had deliberately sent her a photo of us kissing to provoke her. Seeing the chat logs Emily shared with me made my heart ache. So easy to fall in love, but letting go is another story entirely. Emily left the country, got married, had Chloe, divorced, and eventually returned. By then, Ethan was even more unwilling to marry me. If it weren't for my accidental pregnancy, he never would have agreed. After Emily came back, she didn't even need an excuse like heart disease to call him away. A casual phone call was enough to make him drop everything. Sitting across from Ethan now, in this second lifetime, I could no longer feel any love for him. Calmly, I said, "Ethan, I'm not causing drama. I just don't want to marry you anymore." He stared at me for a long moment before sneering. "Fine, but don't come running back to me later." He clearly thought I was joking. After all, every time I said I wanted to end things, I was the one who ended up apologizing and begging to reconcile. This time, I returned the ring and arranged to transfer the apartment entirely to him. As we stood at the doorway after finalizing the paperwork, Ethan smirked mockingly. "And what about the child, Madeline? Whose responsibility is that?" The mention of the baby brought a brief, heavy silence. Reflexively, my hand moved to my abdomen. "I already terminated the pregnancy," I said evenly. Ethan's expression darkened, his eyes turning cold and menacing. "What did you just say? You got rid of the baby? How could you be so heartless?" "Heartless?" I replied, my voice steady. "I'm not as heartless as you, leaving your own daughter to die in a fire." Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked away. That same day, I booked a flight to South City and accepted my new position. A new city, a new environment. Everything was fresh, and I quickly adapted to living alone. I had been on my own since losing my parents at 18, and solitude was something I had grown used to. But peace never lasts. My calm life was soon disrupted. In my previous life, I used to cling to Ethan, texting and calling him incessantly just to hear his voice, which gave me a false sense of security. after giving birth to my daughter. However, I realized that being near him only brought fear and pain. The memories of her burned body, her fragile frame carried out of the fire, haunted me endlessly. She was so small, enduring such unbearable pain. Yet she tried to comfort me. "Mommy, I'm fine. Don't cry." But when I wasn't there, she would secretly cry in agony. In the past few days, Ethan had been bombarding me with messages. He had never been the type to message me before, so I had almost forgotten to delete his contact. His messages were relentless. "Where are you? Madeline? Did you really terminate the pregnancy?" Late at night, his calls came one after another. His voice was hoarse with anger. "Madeline, where are you? What happened to our child? What happened to our daughter? How did he know it was a girl?" I tried to keep my composure. "It's late. If there's something important, we can talk tomorrow." I hung up on him and went to bed. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. My thoughts were scattered, and I felt uneasy. That evening, Jacob called me. "Madeline, do you still have feelings for Dr. Spencer?" His choice of words surprised me. Referring to Ethan so formally felt odd. He was Ethan's junior colleague, someone who had always admired Ethan as a role model and referred to him respectfully as Brother Ethan. But now, his tone was distant, almost formal. It felt odd. I told him plainly, "We've broken up. I don't like him anymore." Jacob's next words shocked me. "Madeline, you and he are not a good match. Please, whatever you do, don't marry him." I had a dream. In the dream, Emily died, and you had a daughter. But Ethan always favored Emily's child, again and again, to the point it led to your and your daughter's deaths. I even dreamed that you went into premature labor because of him. Hearing this, I felt a lump in my throat. My voice trembled slightly. "Thank you, Jacob." After a long pause, he added, "I'm sorry, Madeline. In the dream, it was my fault you went into premature labor. I almost caused you serious harm. Please forgive me." His words froze me. That wasn't just a dream. It was the reality of my previous life. I was left speechless. Does this mean we've both been reborn? It wouldn't be hard for Ethan to find me if he wanted to. With his resources and connections, locating me was only a matter of time. And sure enough, as I left work, I saw him standing outside my office building, his bloodshot eyes fixed on me, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made me uneasy. It reminded me of the Ethan from my past life, and the memory sent shivers down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, trembling slightly as he called out to me through gritted teeth. Calmly, I asked, "What's the matter? Why did you terminate the pregnancy?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Didn't you want her? Don't you know how well-behaved our daughter is?" I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "That's exactly why. Ethan, you don't deserve a well-behaved daughter. Isn't Emily's daughter calling you dad enough to fulfill your dream of fatherhood?" Ethan's face turned pale, his eyes red and misty. The steady stream of people passing by made me uncomfortable discussing such matters in public. I gestured for us to move to a quieter spot. "Madeline," he said softly, his voice trembling, "let's get married. We can have another child. And this time, we'll make sure to have our daughter again." That's when I knew. Ethan had also been reborn. He remembered everything from our previous lives. But how could he have the audacity to bring up our daughter, the one he had essentially condemned to death? I met his gaze, my voice cold. "Ethan, you killed your own daughter. You let your constant favoritism toward Chloe destroy her life. You have no right to call yourself her father." His lips trembled as he paled even further, his tall frame trembling. "You know everything," he whispered, his voice unsteady. I sneered. "Yes, Ethan, I know everything. I've been reborn too. And since you love Emily so much, I'm giving you the chance to be with her." He grabbed my arm, his lips opening and closing as he struggled to find the words. "Madeline, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. After you died, I investigated everything. Emily didn't die. And I saw the villa's security footage. Chloe pushed you. She caused your premature labor under Emily's orders. They wanted you to die, to take you and our baby with you. Or worse, they planned to let you give birth so Chloe and our daughter would share the same birthday, ensuring I'd always neglect our daughter on that day. They wanted her to hate me. To hate you. Ethan's voice cracked as he continued. Chloe deliberately hid at the abandoned factory during the amusement park trip. It was all orchestrated to make you suffer. She had deliberately abandoned our daughter in the wilderness and set a fire to kill her. The thought of it made me want to tear Emily and Chloe apart piece by piece. But even that wouldn't be enough to quench the hatred in my heart. What shocked me the most was learning that Emily had been alive all along in our previous life. She had been orchestrating everything from the shadows, using Chloe as her pawn. A child as young as Chloe couldn't have done such cruel things without someone guiding her. Hearing all of this filled me with a bone-deep chill. As Ethan spoke, his voice broke with sobs. After you and our daughter died, I was devastated. Once I uncovered the truth, I sent Emily and her parents to prison. I'm sorry, Madeline. It was all my fault. Every time I see the evidence, feels like my heart is being torn apart. Like I can't even breathe. I can only sleep if I'm holding a picture of you and our daughter, sitting by your graves, watching his tears. I felt no sympathy, even with Ethan being reborn. I vowed to never let my daughter suffer the same fate again. Ethan choked out through his tears. You've been reborn, haven't you? That's why you told me to go to the hospital to save Emily without hesitation on our wedding day. You'd already given up on me, hadn't you? And I was so foolish, thinking you were being understanding. His eyes turned red as he cried. I thought you were so thoughtful, but you were just completely disappointed in me. Who could have imagined that the Ethan from my past life would return as well, carrying memories of everything after my death? He clung to my hand, unwilling to let go. Ethan, I don't love you anymore. I said coldly. Do you have any idea how much pain I was in when I gave birth alone? My first pregnancy, my first time giving birth. And it became the start of my tragedy. I delivered our child at home by myself, cutting the umbilical cord with a pair of scissors sterilized in boiling water. I only let myself faint after I heard her cry. She was so small, yet Chloe lured her into the mountains, almost killing her there. And when she went missing, your first reaction wasn't to find her but to comfort Chloe. She was just 4 years old. You never celebrated her birthday, not even once. Yet you celebrated Chloe's birthday every year. You have no idea how disappointed she was. Even as she died, she told me not to cry. She asked me, "Why is my dad you?" I practically screamed as I said those words. The pain I'd experienced couldn't be erased, even if I didn't love him anymore. The agony of the past still haunted me. Ethan shook his head, his voice hoarse. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The next day, Ethan left South City. But a month later, he flew back, transferring his position to my city. I had cut off all contact with him. Madeline, please, just look at me. I swear I know I was wrong. I let out a cold laugh. Seeing you makes me sick. Ethan pulled out a file folder. Inside was a notarized document transferring all his assets to me. Madeline, I'm giving you everything I own. Please, take it. I ignored his desperate attempts to make amends. The more he begged, the more afraid I felt. Every time I saw him, my stomach churned with nausea. When he stepped closer to me, I couldn't hold back. I vomited right in front of him. The psychologist told me it was post-traumatic stress disorder. At its worst, even being near Ethan caused my brain to go into oxygen deprivation, and I fainted. After that incident, he never appeared directly in front of me again. Instead, he would stand outside, watching me through a window, not daring to come closer. Emily eventually followed him to South City, but Ethan's once gentle gaze toward her had turned cold and filled with disgust. Get lost, he said, his voice icy. I told Ethan, if you dare come near me again, neither you nor your daughter will have a good life. Soon after, Chloe was no longer able to attend kindergarten. Without Ethan's financial support, her family couldn't sustain their normal lives. Previously, they had lived entirely off of Ethan's money, but since Ethan had transferred all his assets to me, he was left with only his regular salary and no extra funds to spare. I messaged Ethan, offering to return the money, but his reply was simple. I'm sorry. I know the harm I caused you is irreparable. The only thing I can give you now is everything I own. I'm truly sorry. Without financial stability, Emily fell into bad habits, gambling away what little she had. Before long, She accumulated heavy debts and ended up having one of her hands severed as punishment. Her heart condition worsened due to her lack of treatment and her newfound addictions to smoking and drinking, leaving her body completely deteriorated. In her desperation, she begged Ethan for help. Ethan didn't even spare her a glance. His only response was a cold laugh. "Didn't you like to threaten suicide? Now you can die without the effort." Eventually, Emily died a miserable death, consumed by pain. Her parents aged overnight from the stress, and Chloe was sent to an orphanage. After that, I never saw Ethan again. He erected a gravestone in this lifetime for the daughter we lost in the previous one. On the stone, he inscribed "beloved daughter" and sketched an image of her as he remembered her. He often visited the grave, talking to it as if she were there. People whispered that he had gone mad, driven insane by grief and guilt. He had lost his daughter, and in doing so, lost his mind as well. Meanwhile, my life gradually improved. I moved on and rebuilt myself. I donated half of the assets Ethan gave me to a girls' rescue foundation, hoping to honor the memory of our daughter from the past life. When I met Jacob again, he was in South City on a business trip. He was still the same bright and cheerful young man, though now he had become an even more accomplished doctor, surpassing Ethan. "Madeline, I've always felt sorry for what happened to you," Jacob said sincerely. Smiling, I replied, "It wasn't your fault. He was your boss. You didn't have a choice." Jacob had spent both his past and present lives atoning for a single mistake. In our previous life, aside from that one incident, he had always treated me well and shown me respect. Even after what happened, he had done everything he could to apologize and make amends. He truly wanted to be a better person.